Every day, we carry on as if we are free agents, choosing where to go, what to do, and how to live. It sure feels like we decide our actions, from the simple, should I take coffee or tea, to the significant, should I move to a new city? Yet what if this feeling of freedom is misleading? What if, deep down, our choices were already set in motion long before we act on them? This very idea that free will might be an illusion has captivated thinkers for centuries. Spinoza, 17th century, viewed nature as a rigid order that even our minds obey. Schopenhauer, 19th century, claimed our most basic desires are not chosen by us. And Nietzsche, also 19th century, famously called free will a myth born of pride. Centuries earlier, thinkers such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd in the Islamic tradition debated how God's plan interacts with human choice. Each perspective chips away at our naive sense of freedom and suggests that we understand reality more clearly. Most of us take free will for granted. We feel as if our decisions flow from an inner self or soul, separate from the outside world. When I move my arm or speak, it seems obvious. I chose to do it. Psychologists note that believing in free will itself may serve a purpose. It motivates us to take responsibility and strive for improvement. Feeling in control can give people hope that they can change their circumstances, whereas thinking we are puppets of fate might lead to passivity. In a sense, this feeling of freedom could have evolved as an adaptive illusion. Many everyday choices feel like that. For example, you may reach for a snack believing it was a free choice, but often hidden triggers, hunger, habit, or stress, already nudged you moments before. We instinctively think we could have done otherwise, that our choices are entirely up to us. But if we look closely, doubts creep in. Consider this. Would life be completely unpredictable if we really had total free will? If each of our actions were entirely independent of all prior causes, life would be pure chaos. Yet life actually shows patterns and regularities, hinting at underlying forces beyond our whims. This tension between how free we feel and the way life actually unfolds has long puzzled people. Many thinkers point out that every event, from a planet's orbit to a rain shower, follows a chain of causes. If everything is caused by something else, can our free choice break that chain? To ask it another way, are we like drivers with full control of our car, or passengers already on a highway laid out by nature? Imagine, for a moment, living with 100% unchecked free will. Every whim of yours would instantly reshape reality. On one hand, that sounds exciting and powerful. On the other, it would be completely chaotic. Nothing could be predicted or planned. In contrast, the physical world obeys fixed rules. A thrown ball follows a predictable arc. Medicine usually works the same way each time, and a planner before a crowd follows Newton's laws. Why should the human mind alone defy those laws? Some like to think the mind is fundamentally different from inanimate matter. But as we'll see, even this separation has been challenged by modern science. To make sense of all this, philosophers have turned to stories, thought experiments, and the evidence from science. They ask, do we truly hold the steering wheel of our lives? Or are we simply moving along tracks laid down by prior events? In the sections ahead, we'll hear from some of those thinkers and take a journey through time and ideas to uncover this mystery. Is free will real, or is it an illusion? Our modern idea of a determined universe owes a lot to Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century thinker. Spinoza viewed nature as a single, unified substance, which he identified with God or nature. To him, everything follows from the necessities of that single substance, including our own minds. He wrote forcefully, "In nature there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature." In his view, all events are connected like cause and effect, much as the angles of a triangle are determined by each other. Nothing happens by chance. He even turned this insight onto our minds. Spinoza famously said, "In the mind, there is no absolute or free will. The mind is determined to will this or that by a cause that is also determined by another, and this again by another, and so to infinity." In simpler terms, he argued that our thoughts and decisions arise inevitably from prior causes. We may feel conscious of choosing, but according to Spinoza, this consciousness doesn't make our will independent. This clockwork view of nature implies that humans are fully part of that causal order. If you break a clock, the hands stop. If you pry apart the gears, the mechanism fails. Spinoza's idea is similar. Everything that happens, including the firing of neurons in your brain, follows natural laws. We might feel exempt because we perceive ourselves as conscious subjects, but Spinoza would argue that's an illusion born of ignorance. Just as every motion in the heavens has an explanation, so does every decision in a human brain. What does this mean in everyday terms? Essentially, when Spinoza says free will is an illusion, he means our preferences, desires, and even our will itself are products of something like a big recipe we didn't write. Your decision to have an apple rather than a banana, for example, would be determined by countless factors. The taste buds you developed early in life, memories of how apples taste, what you saw for lunch hours ago, your current level of hunger or energy, and even what fruits were available at the store. When Spinoza traced this chain of causes out, he found it stretching back indefinitely. We still seem to choose, but that choice is the end result of a long history, not something created out of nothing. Spinoza believed that much of the confusion about freedom came from thinking of humans as separate from nature. He challenged earlier views, like Descartes' idea of a soul free from physical laws, by saying, everything, even our minds, is in nature. This doesn't make life any less real. It just means our actions have explanations we might not see at first. We still have personalities, motivations, and goals, but Spinoza would insist that these all unfold according to nature's order. To Spinoza, acknowledging that we lack absolute freedom is not depressing. It's simply honest. He thought that once we accept this, we can focus on understanding how to live rather than vainly trying to defy nature. For now, the key point is this. Spinoza offers one of the earliest clear statements that if the universe is fully deterministic, as the clockwork metaphor suggests, then free will, in the sense of absolute independence from causation, cannot exist. This idea, though centuries old, resonates with later science. Newtonian physics and even Einstein's view of the cosmos were deeply deterministic. Moving ahead to the 19th century, Arthur Schopenhauer also tackled this issue with a memorable twist. Schopenhauer spoke of the will as our inner drive to act, and he gave a concise formulation that highlights our dilemma. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. At first glance, this sounds paradoxical, but it captures a core insight. Think about it with an example. Suppose you have a craving for chocolate ice cream, and you pick chocolate instead of vanilla. You might say, I chose chocolate, and that's true. You did what you willed, but could you have willed to crave vanilla instead? Not really. Your craving itself came from who you are, from your biology, habits, and past experiences. Perhaps you had chocolate ice cream as a child and loved it, or maybe stress hormones are pushing you towards sweets right now. Schopenhauer points out that we never get to choose our own desires or character. We only choose among the options those desires create. In other words, we always move within a cage of our own nature. The cage consists of our personality, upbringing, mood, and all the prior causes that made us crave chocolate at this moment. We can act on our craving or resist it, but we didn't conjure the craving out of thin air. It was given to us by a mix of nature and history. Schopenhauer's line highlights how we feel free when we follow our will, yet we fail to see that the will itself is locked inside those conditions. This leads to a subtle point. Believing in an absolutely free will, the idea that we could have done anything at all, regardless of past causes, is mistaken, Schopenhauer thought. Instead, free will is relative. We're free to do what we decide, but we never decide those decisions in a vacuum. If we see ourselves as drivers on a road, Schopenhauer reminds us that the road is shaped by terrain and previous engineers. We can steer, but our path has rails. We might say, I freely chose to turn left, which is true in context, But we didn't create the option of turning left out of nowhere. This insight can actually alter how we view responsibility and character. We might realize that our merits or faults also have causes. Schopenhauer took this further to a moral end. If everyone is acting under necessity, we should respond with compassion. In his view, seeing how people are driven by nature and experience is like seeing them, in a sense, bound by fate rather than truly evil. He used it to argue for pity and humility. For our purposes, though, his main contribution is this: free will, in the absolute sense of being fully unconstrained, is a very limited notion. The question of free will versus determinism was not confined to European thinkers. Islamic philosophers in the medieval era wrestled with it too, blending faith with reason. Two towering figures were Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, 12th century. They lived in a rich intellectual context where theology and philosophy met. In their world, debates on free will were vibrant. Some theologians stressed absolute human freedom, while others emphasized divine destiny. Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd each offered a nuanced perspective. Al-Farabi envisioned an ideal society guided by wisdom, and he firmly believed humans must have freedom to seek the good life. He put it clearly: the very nature of the human being necessitates free will. If a human is forced, then no truly human action can be issued from him, and the purpose of his creation will not be fulfilled. In other words, he argued that if people were mere puppets, nothing truly human would happen. We'd never have genuine knowledge, ethics, or creativity. Instead, God gives humans freedom to learn and choose, teaching us by persuasion rather than forcing us. Al-Farabi connected free will with prosperity and learning. He observed that science, art, and civilization flourish only when people are free to explore and make mistakes. In societies where rulers dictate everything, he said, knowledge dies. So he concluded that divine wisdom granted us freedom, even if within a cosmic order. A century or two later in Andalusia, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, also tickled the balance between God's power and human will. Famous as a commentator on Aristotle, Ibn Rushd argued for harmony between faith and reason. He wrote about how humans act. For humans, the will is the faculty to choose between two options, and it is desire that compels the will to choose. This statement shows his take. We do have the ability to choose, but our choices are driven by our desires, which themselves were created by God. He wasn't suggesting we invent our own free will from nothing. Rather, God gave us faculties and desires that make choice possible. In one sense, our decisions are genuinely ours because we deliberate. In another sense, every desire we have has a backstory. Ibn Rushd tried to steer a middle course. Human beings genuinely pick between alternatives, yet this ability is part of the divine design. In effect, these Islamic philosophers offered a kind of early compatibilist view. They recognized that humans do act with choice in daily life, but that choice operates within God's ordered universe. Both Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd would likely agree that if someone could trace all the causes behind a decision, free will in the absolute sense would vanish. Yet they also insisted that this does not make our choices meaningless. For them, moral accountability survives because we do deliberate and act, even though that process fits into a larger scheme. These ideas show a broader truth. Questions about free will arose in many places and times. Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd were not trying to debunk free will outright. They wanted to understand how divine sovereignty and human responsibility could coexist. Their approach underscores that even in religious contexts, people recognized human choice as important. It's just that they placed it within a bigger context. This middle way, valuing free choice as a gift from God, but not as independent from his laws, parallels what many modern thinkers call compatibilism. By the 20th century, the debate spilled into scientific research. Psychology and neuroscience began offering clues about how the brain makes decisions. For example, the famous experiments of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s showed that a brain signal, the readiness potential, appeared a fraction of a second before subjects consciously reported deciding to move. In other words, the brain seemed to get going a tiny moment before the person thought, "I will move my finger." These and later studies have been eye-opening. More sophisticated experiments have used brain scans to predict a person's choice several seconds before they report making it. In simple tasks, this suggests the brain's decision process can start outside of awareness. Of course, these experiments are still limited, and they don't disprove free will conclusively. But they do challenge the idea that our conscious intention is the original source of action. Beyond the lab, our understanding of genes and development adds weight to the argument. Many of our traits, from temperament to cravings, come from DNA we inherited, which we never chose. Our brains are wired by evolution and early experiences before we have any say. Then life's environment, family, culture, chance encounters shapes us further. By the time we make a simple choice, countless influences have formed who we are. Bullet points can highlight this complexity. Genetics. You did not pick your DNA or the basic nature it gives you. Yet this nature strongly influences your preferences, energy levels, and even moral tendencies. Upbringing and environment. The language you speak, the values you are taught, the foods you love, all are shaped by circumstances beyond your control. These shape how you think and what you want. Brain states. Many decisions start with unconscious brain activity. By the time you feel you made a choice, parts of your brain may have already been preparing for it. Deliberation. Even conscious decision-making follows natural chains. We consider options using our memories, beliefs, and reasoning, which themselves come from past experiences. Brain imaging. Advanced experiments have shown patterns of brain activity that can predict a decision even seconds before a person is consciously aware of making it, suggesting that the mind's choice process begins in the brain before we feel it. Physical laws. Even your brain cells obey chemistry and physics. What goes on inside your skull follows biological rules, just like the rest of the natural world. There's no known break in causality at any level we can measure. Quantum effects. At the smallest scales, events are not strictly determined. However, this randomness doesn't grant real freedom. It only makes outcomes unpredictable. Random quantum events in our brains would not mean we freely willed an action any more than if it were fully determined. In both cases, the outcome is not chosen by an independent agent. It's worth noting that even quantum mechanics, often invoked as a source of randomness, doesn't rescue the traditional notion of freedom. If brain activity had genuine random fluctuations, it would make your decisions unpredictable like a die roll, not under your conscious control. In fact, either extreme, complete determinism, or complete randomness denies the old idea of responsible choice. So science and philosophy together suggest that if free will exists, it must be something other than total causal indeterminacy. So, is free will an illusion? Summing all this up, many thinkers conclude that free will as total independence from cause and effect is indeed an illusion. That is, the notion that you could have done any other thing at a given moment, wholly apart from any history, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. What does this mean for our lives? Some worry that it might sound depressing or fatalistic, but this conclusion can have unexpected benefits. By understanding the deeper causes of our behavior, we can become more compassionate and realistic rather than harsh or despairing. Some philosophers label themselves compatibilists. They say this is largely a matter of definition. They argue that free will simply means acting according to our own reasoning and desires, rather than being forced by an outside power. By this view, many of our daily choices still count as free in an important sense. For example, if you decide to help someone out of kindness, you feel responsible, and indeed, you are acting on your own character. Compatibilists would say that counts as genuine freedom, even if your kindness was partly shaped by biology and experience. In contrast, some thinkers, often called libertarians in philosophy, insist we do have a more radical freedom. They claim human consciousness can somehow start a new chain of cause without being wholly determined. But this idea raises puzzles. If the mind is not bound by physical laws, how does it cause a different outcome in the body? Without a clear mechanism for an uncaused choice, Many scientists and philosophers remain skeptical of this stronger view. In daily life, people continue to act as though they are free, and society still relies on that assumption for practical reasons. Legal systems still punish criminals and reward heroes, because those ideas help keep order. But understanding the illusion can change how we explain behavior. Instead of simply blaming someone for choosing evil, we might look deeper at the factors behind their actions: upbringing, genetics, circumstances. This doesn't mean we let people off the hook. Rather, we might respond with more care to change those conditions. Some argue that for society to function, it's useful to act as if we have free will. It encourages responsibility. Others note that a hardened belief in free will isn't necessarily needed. Compassion and understanding can be built on knowing we are influenced beings. This debate has real implications. If we fully embraced hard determinism, how might we treat each other? Some suggest we'd focus more on prevention, education, and rehabilitation rather than blame. For instance, realizing that poverty or trauma heavily shape choices might lead us to address those root issues. On the other hand, even the illusion of freedom can motivate people to try harder and improve themselves because they feel their choices matter. In practice, society so far maintains the language of choice and responsibility, and perhaps rightly so, since abandoning it overnight could be confusing. But we also see signs of the new perspective. Psychology and the justice system slowly incorporate the idea that blame might be replaced by understanding. Importantly, all these perspectives converge on a kind of modest middle ground. We are not omnipotent beings casually ignoring cause and effect, yet we are not entirely pushed around by fate either. We still deliberate, decide, and make plans. Compatibilists would say, as long as you act voluntarily on your own motives, you can rightly call that free choice. And even if free will in the deep sense is an illusion, that doesn't stop us from living as agents in our world. We can take pride in our rational minds and moral efforts, while also recognizing that those are part of nature's plan. Ultimately, this is not just a dry academic question. It's a profound insight about human nature. We often say, "I couldn't help it," or "that's just how I am," to explain our actions. These common phrases hint that we instinctively know something is pulling the strings behind our will. The realization that we are shaped by history can actually humble us. When someone else falters, we might think, given their background, I might have done the same. And it can motivate us. Even if our will is not cosmic freedom, it's still enough to try to break a few links by changing our habits, educating ourselves, or improving our environment. We can change how the next link forms.